So how do we cope when we see our parents get older? For many of us, this can be quite a deeply emotional topic. Now, I've been lecturing on the concepts of aging for several years now, and the psychological frameworks around aging can really help us understand as well as cope with the aging process. Not just when watching our own parents decline, but also for our own aging process. Now, I mainly teach these concepts to younger university students, but what we find is that the concepts resonate mostly with those who experienced aging firsthand, and these tend to be middle-aged and older adults. And this is why I want to share these insights today more widely in this video. So I had a moment recently when a family member shared a photograph, and I was struck by just how much older they looked compared to how I remembered them. And it's that raw fear that time is running out, and the sadness that you see in their tired eyes, and a kind of helplessness of not being able to do anything about it. And we may also feel guilty for not being able to spend enough time with them, because life gets busy and we may live further afield, so we may not be able to visit them. In my case, for example, I live in a different country, so I only get to see my parents about twice a year. So these feelings of fear, sadness, and guilt are real, and they will come back time and again whenever we see a further change of decline in our parents. And the question is, how can we process these feelings so that they don't weigh us down so much? Now, to answer that question, we need to understand what exactly our negative emotions are really about. Well, fundamentally, these emotions are about loss. The loss of our parents' vitality, the loss of their expressions, the things they used to be able to do when we were younger, and ultimately, we actually fear the loss of their life. So what we're really dreading is loss. And this is where the psychological framework I'm about to share can really help. It gives us a way to make sense of these emotions that come with loss, like fear, sadness, and guilt, and show us how to gradually learn to cope with these emotions over time. So coping itself is not a quick fix, right? Many people think that if they only had a right strategy, they would feel better straight away. But that's not how it works, especially not with ongoing losses like watching our parents decline. But by engaging with the framework, we become aware of our own emotions, and gradually we learn to accept the age-related changes and actually make peace with them. So there tend to be 5 different emotions that we experience when we experience loss. And they were established in the 1960s by a lady called Elizabeth Kübler-Ross. Now, Elizabeth Kübler-Ross at the time was working in palliative care in various hospitals, and she spoke to many patients who knew their lives were nearing the end, for example, after a terminal diagnosis. So these patients were facing the ultimate loss, which is life itself. And across these conversations, she noticed a pattern. Right? There were 5 emotional stages that people tended to move through. The first one was denial, then anger, bargaining, depression, and the final stage of acceptance, which tends to bring some peace and relief. So I want to show you how each of these stages actually help us cope with the sense of loss that we feel when watching our own parents decline. Now, it's worth noting that the stages aren't always in a straight order, so sometimes you might skip one or then circle back to a previous stage, depending on how you feel on the day and what triggers you. Now, the first stage, as I said, is denial. That's simply denying that the aging process is happening. Now, I noticed first that my parents were getting older during a visit to the Canary Islands in my late 30s. And we used to go on hiking tours on the island, half-day or full-day excursions, and my parents were quite fit and energetic at the time. But on this particular trip, something had shifted, right? There weren't any hiking plans, and instead we kind of wandered through small villages or took shorter walks or simply sat around in cafes and restaurants more often. And it suddenly hit me that something had changed. My parents weren't as active anymore. And my way of denying these initial signs of aging were to focus on the positives, right? I told myself that walking less is just part of a normal healthy aging process. And you know, my parents were still well, and they were only in their mid to late 60s. So surely, you know, we still had decades ahead of us. So I wasn't ignoring the fact that they were aging, but I was softening it. And I think that's a common early reaction, one of denial. You know, we notice the small changes, but we reassure ourselves. And that is a way of protecting ourselves from a deeper fear of loss. And that in itself is the coping mechanism, where we only let in as much as we can handle at the time. Now, the second stage in Kübler-Ross's model is anger. For example, we may feel angry about having to witness our parents getting older. Why do we have to carry that burden, right? It doesn't seem fair. So this is anger being directed at the situation itself. But on other times, we may actually project the anger onto people. For example, a doctor we think should have done more when our parents become ill, or even directly at our parents. So you may find yourself snapping at your dad, telling him to cut down on alcohol or eat better, saying things like, well, if you want to stay healthy, you need to do your part. I don't want to lose you. But underneath that anger is a feeling of pain, right? A sense of losing control. So in that sense, when we use anger, it serves us as a coping strategy because it puts us in a state of power, even if only just temporarily. Now, the third stage is bargaining. So this is where we may start negotiating with time, hoping to slow down our parents' aging process, even though deep down we know we can't. Bargaining often comes with guilt, like feeling bad for not seeing our parents enough. So we may say things like, just hang on until Christmas, I'll visit then, and we'll do all the lovely things together that we missed out upon. And that's a bit like saying to your parents, hold off and don't age any further, I'll be there soon. So bargaining is just another way to cope and reduce our own guilt, because it feels like we're doing something. And actually sometimes that can help the parents too, because it gives them something to look forward to. So if you find yourself bargaining in some ways, you may be using that as a coping mechanism to try and delay the inevitable. The fourth stage is depression. Now, by depression, I don't mean in any clinical sense, but more related to a feeling of sadness and melancholy that can suddenly overcome us when the reality of aging really sinks in. So, for example, you may feel a deep sadness, not just about your parents changing, but about everything else that seems to be slipping away. So it's that quiet grief for how things used to be, the nice memories of your parents in the past, and knowing that it will never be like that again. And also the helplessness of not being able to stop time. So this stage can feel quite heavy, but it is another coping mechanism of coming to terms with loss, in a sense, right? So depression is the stage when we begin to surrender to our own parents aging, and that surrender can bring some relief. So we're no longer fighting the aging process with anger or bargaining, but instead we're now silently acknowledging that aging is just part of being human. Now, the final stage is acceptance. So this is where we really begin to live with the reality of aging, not with sadness or resistance and anger, but with clarity and peace. So we're now starting to accept it. And there is a sense of freedom in that stage, really, because we're no longer stuck in the emotional struggle of intense fear, sadness, guilt, anger, and so on. And this allows us to be more present with our parents now, to really cherish the time and appreciate them as they are now. So acceptance, of course, doesn't eliminate the pain of seeing our parents get older, but it helps us to carry it with more ease. So in summary, coping with the age-related changes in our parents is an emotional process. There isn't just one coping strategy that relieves us from all the negative emotions, but we tend to go through a variety of different stages, often interchangeably, before we reach a more sort of stable feeling of acceptance and acknowledge that aging is actually inevitable. So thank you for listening today. If you'd like to share how you've been feeling about seeing your parents get older, I'd love to hear from you in the comments section. And if this video helped you to better understand your emotions around your aging parents, give it a like and also click subscribe to kind of stay connected with more teachings on aging well. Take good care of yourselves. Until next time, goodbye.